Hello, my name is David Williamson. I'm the senior pastor of Zionsville United Methodist Church in Indiana, and this is a series of short videos exploring the topic of same-sex marriage in the Bible. Full disclosure, I lean towards the affirming side of the debate, but I am often asked by members of my church, how do I read the Bible and come to this conclusion? A conclusion that, at least on the face of it, seems to contradict multiple verses in the Bible. So this series is my attempt to share how I read the Bible. I'm not a professor, I hold no PhDs, I'm a pastor, trying to faithfully serve my congregation, and above all, I'm a person of faith who has wrestled with the Bible and tried to hold its teachings together with those I know and love who identify as gay, bisexual, or transgender. So let's start with a particular verse in the Gospels, Matthew 16:19. In this verse, Jesus was speaking directly to Peter, who had just made the great confession. He had just proclaimed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, and in response, Jesus praised him and promised him, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then Jesus repeated these exact same words in Matthew 18:18 to all the disciples. So what is this loosing and binding that Jesus is talking about? Well, he was talking about the covenant, the law. To loose something was to allow it. To bind it was to forbid. We see Jesus doing this in his own ministry. He loosed some of the practices around Sabbath keeping, teaching that Sabbath was created for man, not man for Sabbath. But he also bound certain practices too, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus repeatedly quoted and then expanded those portions of the law that teach us to love our neighbor and even our enemy. So in Matthew 16 and 18, Jesus conferred the same authority to his followers to continue this sacred task. Now, if we fast forward to the book of Acts, we can see the early church practicing this loosing and binding, particularly as the church expanded to include Gentile believers. The primary question was, do these Gentile believers need to become Jewish, to be circumcised and to follow all aspects of Mosaic law? Well, in Acts 15, we read about a council of church leaders convened specifically to address this issue. Both Peter and Paul gave testimony before the council about how the Holy Spirit had moved among them and made no distinction between them and us. So after much debate and much listening, finally, James, the brother of Jesus and leader of the Jerusalem church, rendered the verdict. We should not trouble these Gentiles who are coming to God, he said. They loosed the requirement to be circumcised and to follow dietary cleanliness laws, because those requirements were creating division in the body and setting an unnecessary stumbling block before those who were coming to faith in Jesus. They also bound certain parts of the law. James mentions 4 things in particular, and these same 4 would be repeated 2 more times in the book of Acts. Gentile believers, he said, would do well to abstain from eating anything that has been dedicated to an idol, meat that had been strangled, and also from eating blood, and also to abstain from fornication. Porneia is the Greek word. We'll come back to that in our next video. What all those things had in common was that they were parts of pagan temple practices, and they were also all addressed by a portion of the Old Testament law, Leviticus 17 through 19. So let's go there. Now, this portion of Jewish law was written to both the Jewish people and to the resident aliens among them. Perhaps this is why James focused on these instructions, seeing the Gentiles as resident aliens among the Jewish church. So Leviticus 17 focused primarily on the slaughter and sacrifice of animals. It helps explain at least one of the restrictions in Acts, the prohibition against consuming blood. For the life of every creature is in its blood, Leviticus 17:14. Which makes blood holy, and it helps explain why blood was used as a sacrifice for atonement. These verses were later applied in the New Testament in the letter to the Hebrews to explain how Jesus' sacrifice makes atonement for us. As Jesus said at the Last Supper even, this is my blood, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. That's Leviticus 17. Now Leviticus 19 primarily concerns how we treat one another in society. There are numerous provisions to protect the vulnerable. Farmers were to leave food unharvested at the margins of their fields so the poor could find something to eat. Employers were warned against giving unfair, non-livable wages. Judges were instructed to give fair verdict without respect to someone's wealth or position in society. But in addition to these provisions, there were general laws not to lie, steal, slander, hate, hold grudges, seek vengeance. All of this summed up with a command that Jesus quoted as the second part of his great commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's Leviticus 19. Now, in between those two chapters is Leviticus 18, which is of primary interest to us because it contains prohibitions around sex. The majority of the chapter, verses 6 through 20, focus on relationships within the household. Just about every relationship other than husband-wife is named. Parent, child, brother, sister, step-sibling, half-siblings, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, grandparents, in-laws. And in all these relationships, sex and abuse are strictly forbidden. Then in verse 21, there's an odd verse. Odd because it doesn't mention sex explicitly. It just forbids the sacrifice of children in worship. Verse 22 forbids men from sleeping with other men. Verse 23 forbids both men and women from having sexual relationships with annuals. Given the reference to the sacrifice in verse 21, it's possible that verses 22 and 23 refer to sexual practices that, again, were part of pagan worship. Now, the prohibition against men lying with other men is repeated again in Leviticus 20:13, and in both places, it's described as an abomination. This word abomination can feel harsh, clear, demonstrative, but it's important to note other practices also described as abomination in the law. The eating of pig, rabbit, or shellfish in Leviticus 11, or women dressing in men's clothes in Deuteronomy. So it's clear this word can describe actions that are culturally taboo, not just ethically wrong. And most often, when this word appears in the Old Testament, 80% out of the 117 times it appears, it is used in relation to the worship of false gods and foreign idols. We'll talk more in future videos about the connection between idolatry and sexual practices. What we need to pay attention to, I think traditionalists and progressives alike, is the prologue to both chapters 18 and 19 in Leviticus. In Leviticus 19:2, God commands, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." To be holy was to be set apart. And in Leviticus 18:3, "You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan where I'm bringing you. You shall not follow their ways." In these verses, we are warned of taking our cues for what is acceptable to God from the surrounding cultures in which we live. We are to be holy, seeking what is pleasing to God, not just what is acceptable to man. And that's a word we must hear and honor no matter where we come out on this issue. But I also want you to understand that it's complicated, that these few chapters of Leviticus often juxtapose the profound and the problematic. For instance, right after the Great Commandment, the very next verse forbids us from wearing clothes of mixed fiber, from sowing a field with two kinds of seed, or intermingling different breeds of animals, which at best sounds trivial, but for centuries this verse was used to outlaw the marriage of those belonging to different races. The next verses are even harder. They describe what should happen if someone had sex with a female slave who was designated for another man but not yet ransomed. In that case, a single ram offering was all that was required. Light punishment, really. Sex with slaves wasn't condemned nearly as strongly as all the other types of sex in the previous chapter. So does that mean we throw it all out? Or do we keep it all in? It's not that simple. There are things in these chapters that we would want to uphold. The Great Commandment, the protection of the vulnerable, the warning against idolatry, the command to be set apart from the culture. But we also can't pretend that all these verses are equally applicable. There are things in these chapters that reflect a limited cultural understanding of the time. That's why the church is empowered to do the sacred work of binding and loosing, to determine what is required for faithful living and witness in the world, and to discard what is no longer required, what is culturally bound and not reflective of the will and character of God. The Jerusalem Council is one example of the church doing this work, and the work of binding and loosing has continued throughout history as the church has reconsidered its previous understanding of science, its position on slavery, marriage between those of different races, the role of women in the church, divorce and remarriage. We don't do this work lightly. Jesus did not give his disciples freedom to do whatever they want, but we are charged to faithfully consider what needs to be bound, retained, and what needs to be loosened and let go, so that people can be free to faithfully follow and honor God in their lives. I believe that this is such a moment in the life of our church. In future videos, I'll take us through some more passages that I think might guide us as we do this sacred task. Until then, thanks for starting this journey with me.